I'm James, and today we're going to look at Pandyman Entertainment's brand new game, Trench Offensive. So, disclaimer at the start of the video, I haven't bought this. Paul, actually, bless him, sent me this free of charge as a review copy because he knows I've reviewed quite a few of his bits on the channel previously. So he sent me this to have a look at. It comes in quite a nice box. It's quite deep, which is quite useful for storing more things in it afterwards. Let's have a look what we've got inside. So it's a nice solid cardboard box. We've got the rule book. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Look at the other bits first. We've got some bases, 32mm bases. Personally, I'd rather them slightly smaller, but I think as long as you're consistent as you're playing it, that's not a problem. We've got some dice, 2d6 and a scatter dice. We've got then the figures, so let's have a look what we've got with the figures. Now the figures come with separate heads. We've got, I'll bring that absolutely closer so you can have a look, we've got a total of 7 heads in there. Is that right? Yep, so 8 heads, sorry, my apologies. We've got British, we've got 3 helmeted heads wearing the Brody helmet, one of which looks like it's wearing a gas mask. Respirator if you want to be technical, and we've got a field cap or officer's cap. From the Germans we've got a Pickelhaube, we've got a couple of the field caps, one of which is wearing a respirator, and we've got a standard Stahlhelm. So reasonable choice of heads. Personally I'd like them all to be looking similar. I'd have liked balaclavas and things. If you're a 3D printer fan, that could be an easy option for you. I'm not that good at that. And then we've got the figures, so I'll get these out because they're quite nice resin figures, complete with a bag that's really hard to get into if you've got my fingers. So I'll just pull a couple out at random. Okay, no we won't, we'll get the whole lot out, it might be easier. So we have German with what looks, yeah, it is a Luger and an entrenching tool carrying the large pack. I probably wouldn't have gone for the large pack for trench raiding, but hey, I can live with it. And then we've got, let's see if I can get make sure I get the right ones. Yep, they look like the German ones. Then we've got 2 bodies with rifles. Quite nicely done, and some nice animation in the figure there working the bolt. And then for the British we've got carrying a pistol, looks like a Webley, and an entrenching tool again with the large pack. And then we've got 2 rifle figures. I'm not sure I've got these the right way around. I'll have to have a look at them in more detail later. I like the fact mugs are carried on the large packs. That's what was quite good. Now one thing I do need to emphasize is the figures are probably not quite right for British troops. They look to me as if they've got a more Mauser style front end on the rifle rather than the number 4 front end, but Paul is at great pains to point out this is inspired by the First World War. It's not a historically accurate game, which is fair enough. He's open and honest about that. And hey, if you are a historical fan, then no doubt you can also alternative figures. Then we've got the boards. Now I like the fact it actually comes with a board so you can start playing without having to actually build all the terrain. I'm going to build a nice terrain system. This is the attacking end, and if you've seen Paul's live version of this where he's built this up, it's fantastic looking. You've got the wreck tank, you've got the trench system. It's not a historically accurate trench system. It's got 1 or 2 little issues with that, but it's nice. It will get you started if nothing else. I get really picky on things like this, and in all fairness, this is more a Hollywood type game rather than historically accurate. See my rant about all quad on the Western Front for details. But it's reasonably representative, it does the job, and down at each end you've actually got basic information about the game, including the turn sequence, which is quite nice. So you have two different parts to this. This is from the defender's end, and you can see this time it's sort of going further and further into a trench system. So yeah, and again, information repeated down the end. So that's quite nice, I do quite like that. I'll put those back in the box, and let's have a look at the rule book. Now the rule book is 62 pages long. I'm going to assume it's 62. No, it's actually going to be, if you want to be technical, 64 if you include the covers, 60 if you don't. It's a very thick card. I mean, you know, it's solid paper, this. The style, I have to admit, I looked at it and thought, I recognise that, and I spent a while looking after I first saw Paul's mock-up of this, and it looks like it's basically copied from the 53rd Welsh Division's trench notes. So it's a very authentic looking approach. So in the inside we've got a letter home, and sort of, you know, typical sort of shot from the period, sort of quick introduction. Now it sort of talks very much about how the game is. You've got a contents page. I always like a contents page because that really does help. We've got the introduction. Now the introduction explains about the game. It says it doesn't look at the war's socio-economic, diplomatic or other causes, doesn't look at the Sarajevo assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a 20-year-old Gavrilo Princip, the military build-up of the European nations in the years before the Great Conflict, the strange build-up of the webs of alliances. It's all about the raiding. Now, I'm quite bemused by that, because I always thought that the whole Great War kicked off because some guy called Archduke shot an ostrich because he was hungry. And if you recognise that quote, you will understand where this game is coming from. So it explains that this is inspired by. It is not a historically accurate game. You know, that is open and upfront. And it's nicely illustrated with photos that Paul's done of the figures. So it talks about how to get started, what you need, the basic rules. It gives you the real basic breakdown, statistic breakdown, because each figure has got its own statistics, and we'll look at those in a bit. The whole concept of the game of advantage and disadvantage, and if you've played threat level emergency response, you will fully understand that. Basically, you roll two six-sided dice, and I'll do a demo of this just so you can see how it works. So there are two states. You can have advantage and disadvantage. It just gets slightly more complex. So I've rolled a 4 and a 2. Now if I roll with advantage, I choose the lower roll, so I would class as a 2. If I was doing it with disadvantage, I would class it as a 4. So low rolls are good, high rolls are bad. So advantage and disadvantage is fairly straightforward there. There are some others. You can have a double with advantage, and if that's the case, then a hit will always inflict an extra wound and so on. So it's fairly straightforward. It talks about when you would have disadvantage, the rules of engagement, sort of what you have to do to win the game, the initiative phase, and basically you just roll two six-sided dice. You then get the event phase, the player who's won initiative rolls to see what happens, and it does work slightly differently to threat level emergency response, where a side moves then the other. Here one side moves one figure, the other side moves, and it alternates between. So that makes sense. You then get the interactions. You get complacency checks, which could be used, for example, if a sentry's been on duty for a while, to see if they're actually alert. You get an over-the-top check. If you're out of the trench, there's a random chance each turn that you may actually get hit. Random hit, basically, flying around. You can then move, and the rule talks about normal terrain, impassable terrain. It doesn't talk about difficult terrain. Paul has done an errata for this, where he sort of differentiates what the difference is with them. So we talk about regular movement, advanced movement, which is basically double moving, Targeting, which is when basically you're taking the time to stop and fire. Charging, jumping in from a charge, so you can dive into the trench. It's worth noting that the rules don't mention getting in and out of the trench. Again, that's covered in the errata. What to do if you are charged: you can recoil, hold or retreat. So you have that. You then get the combat phase. It talks about line of sight, how to do ranged combat, how to do melee combat, and a medical combat. Now medical combat is basically works the same way, but instead of doing damage you actually heal hits on the figure. You've then got morale, and it talks about there when to check morale. Again, this is clarified on the errata. I do think you need the errata to go with this, but on the published versions of the game, Paul is sending it out. This was a pre-production one, and he's put it up on the web page, so it's easy accessed. How to set up the game, the turn sequence, and you get into the recruitment office. Now you start with 5 armies in this. I know Paul is working on expanding these, further details on these, and actually extra options, plus rules for vehicles, and I believe going into the fantastic things like mecha and so on. So you have basically the British Empire, the French Republic, the United States, Imperial Germany and the Ottomans. You've then got how to build your force. You have one leader, either a junior officer or an NCO. Junior officers generally are a bit more enthusiastic but less effective. The NCO is usually a grizzled veteran. Your troops, then you've got veterans, privates and medics, plus the unstable one. This is basically where somebody has gone a bit battle mad, for want of a better description. Be interesting to actually see an officer version of that as well. I keep thinking of Sassoon when he's desperate to win his 2nd military cross, so that might work there. Points, standard thing for that. Setting up the battlefield, and then we come on to the actual raids themselves. You've got Total War, which is basically fight each other until one dies. Capture the flag. If you play paintball, it's basically that. You have a flag at each end. First team to get the flag back to their end wins. Escape the trenches, so you actually want to get out. Nice and straightforward. Some of these are missing rules, like the objective placement. Again, see the errata for that. In waves, so this time the defender gets just his troops, whereas the attacker keeps getting replacement troops, so that's quite an interesting one. Pigeonhole, and I'm going to read the raid briefing on this and you will see Paul's inspiration for where the game came from. Speckled Jim has got lost in the trenches with vital information for the frontline troops to advance. However, Speckled Jim is also a delicious plump-breasted pigeon and the troops are hungry. Yeah, I think we can see where this is going, and I think actually that's a good summing up of the game. It is very much Blackadder history. It's that level. It's the impression of the war rather than the reality. So sabotage, basically sneaking around the trenches, with a very interesting victory condition for the attacker, where they actually score extra victory points for not killing the enemy, which I find is quite an interesting one. Behind the lines, again, this is one which is crying out for a figure for this. A national hero is stuck in the enemy trench. This treasure will cause 500 young women to kill themselves if they should go missing. That's why the raid is scheduled. Yeah. Comb for rations. So basically you're now trying to get rations. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be crying out for a random chart for what the rations were. If you got the plum and apple jam, then you probably don't score much at all. If you're raiding the German trench, you might find bottles of Perrier, which bizarrely was one of the things that the Germans used to supply their troops with fresh water. You had the Perrier plant just behind the front line. It was an ideal way to get water forward. We've then got the events list. Like I said, I love the black and white photos in this. They are really nice. So the events cover things like nothing happens, gas, 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 a strafing run, and basically you're attacked by an aircraft, a sniper, iron rations, which is basically a shell landing. I'd probably call that random hit, but that's just my personal preference. And reinforcements, you might get an extra unit. So looking at the statistics, they are very interesting. Most forces will have the junior officer, the NCO, the veteran, the private, the medic and unstable. Paul's given me his blessing to actually add more to these. I probably will at some point write a bit more of an historical list, particularly for the trench raiders, because, for example, the only troops carrying grenades are the NCOs, and I really think that that should be expanded to a lot of the troops. You've got the veteran can have a rifle or a pistol and a melee weapon, whereas the privates just carrying rifles. On a trench raid it wouldn't be unreasonable to give them pistols and melee weapons as well. Medic is unarmed, which is fair enough, and the unstable is the option of both again. You've then got the French Republic, very, very, very similar, although their privates can have ranged weapons or melee weapons. You do find that some of these do have slightly different statistics between the nationalities. I'm not fully convinced that they're accurate. The French have got very high willpower score, which I think is right for somewhere like Verdun, but after the mutinies after the Nivelle offensive in 1917, that probably needs dropping down. There's nothing stopping you using the statistics for another country to more accurately reflect the troop type you want. So yeah, for the Germans, again very similar. They seem to have the addition of throwing knives coming in there, and again their privates have got different options. You've got rifle and a melee weapon, but for extra points, or you can just have a melee weapon. Yeah, okay. You know, other than that, fairly similar. The Ottomans, again, slightly different statistics, but they've got the options of move and shoot. I'm not quite sure why that is in there, but again, it does differentiate the troops. The US is slightly different. They don't have the NCOs. They've got junior officers, veterans and privates, and no unstable as well. Given that probably the last casualty of the war was an American who went berserk charging the German lines, I think it's perfectly reasonable to include them. Paul does say he's going to expand on the Americans in the supplement, which is fine. The weapons chart has got plenty of weapons which aren't actually given in the army lists. So you have things like the flare pistol, flamethrowers, probably I think slightly overranged with the 21-inch range, machine guns, shotguns, which would be a good addition to the Americans because they did carry shotguns, various weapons. Melee weapons are much of a muchness basically. If you've got a melee weapon, you've got a melee weapon, with the exception of the dud club, which on a roll of 6 explodes. Basically it's someone using a grenade as a club. I personally would remove the fuse, but that is just me. So there are various bits there. There are some oddities in there again. Like I've just spotted one which I didn't mention to Paul, of the heavy club, which gives you no real advantage in melee, but does slow the person down to half speed. That possibly seems a bit excessive. But yeah, there's the various rules to go with them. Again, these have been errated. Inexperience has changed, for example. But you've got rules for that, the pigeon and so on. You've then got a flamer template, and flamer template, if you're an old Games Workshop fan, you'll remember when that used to be used. So similar concept with that. You've got the small and large blast templates. If you're a modeler, you can have great fun with those. You could just start putting clouds on and things like that. You've got the copyright and credits, and it does sort of show that Paul is working on a very small company, and I do think small companies deserve support. So you know, when you look through it, I know that most of the names are Paul and Anne, his wife. So you've also got a rather dad level joke there. Yeah, that's the level. So that's the game. it is quite a nice concept. There are a few games floating around like this now, but as a starter set, I think this has got some massive advantages because you've got those boards. They are very, very useful. You've got a few figures to start you off. You've got the dice. You don't need a lot more than this. You basically need a tape measure and some glue to put the figures together. And once you've done that, you're basically good to go. So it's a really nice concept, as basically putting the whole game in the box rather than making you go out and buy different figures, make your terrain boards and so on. So yeah, I like it. I've played the game briefly, Paul's demo, and my intention is to sort of do a couple of games and do some playthroughs at some point when things ease up a little bit. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please click on the like button below so that I know what people like and I know what to make more of. Alternatively, if you've enjoyed it and think you'd like to see more, please click on the subscribe button. That way you get notified by YouTube whenever I bring out a new video. And you never know, there might be something in there that you hadn't considered, because I do cover a variety of things on the channel. And finally, if you have a little bit of cash going, I now have a Patreon account. I'm always looking for patrons because at the end of the day, let's be perfectly honest, it's a good way for me to get a little bit of money that I'll use to buy review items or to travel to museums and so on. I don't put a huge amount on that. At the minute, all we've got is one tier charging £1 a month, which just, as I say, helps cover my costs. See you soon.